Employing all sorts of monsters, beasts, and weird creatures in battle is a common element of many fantastical settings, unsurprisingly so. Not only is this a prominent aspect of our own world, taking it further is an interesting idea, as many more tactics, maneuvers, army compositions, and power dynamics become possible. Vicious monstrosities duking it out on the battlefield also has a certain charm to it. However, as with many elements of storytelling and world building, this is also an area where realism often takes a backseat, and the rule of cool is employed in its stead. As you probably already know, this is not a necessity though. Monsters in battle are far from impossible or implausible when working within the limitations of a world. While in the majority of cases they would be less over-the-top or flashy, consistently following a set of well-established rules offers more narrative satisfaction, and the trade-off can be minuscule in many cases. So how could one go about grounding militarized monsters? Well, that is a rather complex question to answer. It is very closely linked to the nature of the setting, even more so than most of the things I've already shared my thoughts on. Technological level is perhaps more crucial than all others, but the capabilities of the beast in question, logistics, potential weaknesses, alternatives, and how all of this affects the world are rather significant influencing parameters too. I will do my best to tackle the topic from every angle, or at least as many as I can tackle it from. That being said, I will not discuss creature design in detail. That's practically an endless subject. I mean, more than half, probably more than 3/4 of my channel is about engineering animals, so I am simply going to assume that the employed monsters make sense and properly function in their own setting, as they should. Anyway, let's begin our journey through all the layers involved in this seemingly simple concept, beginning on the why. Why is it a good idea to use creatures in warfare that are not close analogues to humans? What possible advantages could they offer? We need only look at our own world to figure that one out. Humans, especially those living in previous eras, have a limited set of skills. It is true that the array is quite wide, but does not cover everything. Animals that aid in menial work have been around ever since the first couple of species were domesticated, but that is not necessarily linked to warfare. However, there is an argument to be made how beasts of burden did have a role in the construction of fortifications, offering greater strength and more stamina than what a person could muster. Whether or not you consider these war animals, until the invention of complicated machines that could do the job better, they were instrumental in conflicts, and many less advanced settings would also need to rely on them, be it simple cattle or something more resembling a Regaliceratops. What's more, in some scenarios, they did very much step on the battlefield, most notably helping reposition heavy cannons. That being said, depending on their relative size, strength, difficulty of control, and upkeep, sooner or later all of them would be outclassed by machines if they do not offer some other unique advantage human invention cannot replicate. Animals that were used more actively on the battlefield are not uncommon either throughout history. Among the first creatures employed in large-scale warfare were horses, with evidence of their utilization dating as far back as 3000 BC. Drawing murderous carriages and chariots at first, they slowly transitioned into mounts with the advent of horsemanship. Cavalry was a dominant force in human conflicts from the era of pointed sticks to the time of rifles. Wide-scale use of mounted forces were common as late as the initial skirmishes of the First World War, but some horse-based battalions still saw use during the second one. Even to this day, some military forces use equine alternatives to modern transport options. All of this is thanks to the numerous advantages of these hoofed animals. They are relatively easy to control due to a mixture of their intelligence, nature, selective breeding, and several millennia of collective experience. A crucial trait for any creature to be actively involved in spilling blood, but only a prerequisite and not the actual reason to be employed. I'm not surprising anyone by saying that horses are fast, strong, and can run a good long while, plus they do not require constant, unwavering attention to obey the rider. Well, not if they are trained well. If you grab a person and put it on a fine mare, or even just a chariot drawn by it, you have already made a unit that is better than the sum of its parts. faster than a human, more intelligent than a horse, and braver than either on their own. Decorating them with protective gear and appropriate weaponry is just icing on the cake. I have mentioned people still use horses in eras where motorized vehicles are a thing, while far from a dominant option where modern forms of transportation are too expensive or not feasible to traverse the terrain, an equine replacement is an excellent choice. Riding a horse does not prevent a soldier from using most weapons, and what they lose with the potential of wielding miniguns or rocket launchers, they are compensated for in speed and versatility. Taking a look at horses really highlights what a good war animal might be, one that supplements a soldier. If a fantastical monster can be combined with a human analog soldier, making a disciplined unit with augmented capabilities, that is more than enough reason to start deploying them onto the battlefield. There are a few things to look out for, but we are still discussing potential reasons, so let's stay on course. To further strengthen the hypothesis I presented, we need only to take a look at what other mounts were thrown at the enemy throughout history. One prominent horse equivalent that comes up is the camel. Now, it is important to note that where these animals were used, horses were also employed. However, where one animal is lacking, the other excels, presenting two viable options depending on the circumstances. Naturally, camels are better suited to arid environments as they evolved there. Resilient and adaptable, in hot, dry and inhospitable areas, these hunt mounts were and still are a more optimal choice. Additionally, some historic accounts suggest that the smell of these desert riders is unsettling for their equine counterparts, presenting a potent anti-cavalry benefit. Indeed, their unique fragrance was a key deciding factor in at least one known conflict, the Battle of Karkar. Plus, their massive size is more effective at inspiring fear in the heart of infantry, not even mentioning the option to mount two soldiers on a single animal in the case of larger breeds and species. That being said, there are comparative drawbacks to using camels as well. They cannot reach the same speed, strength and stamina as a proper warhorse can. There we have the trade-off, making them both sensible options. From a world-building perspective, this highlights an important element when it comes to war beasts. If multiple species are employed for similar roles, one cannot be better in all aspects than the other. There needs to be a balance, as one of the options would be quickly phased out in favor of the superior one. It can be anything from better performance under certain conditions to a lower upkeep, but there has to be something, and that something has to be noticeable. We have to keep in mind that breeding and taking care of two entirely different species with their varying needs can be a heavy investment. All in all, redundancy is to be avoided, and redundancy in this sense is not confined to carbon copies only. To further emphasize how beasts that serve a similar role can be widely distinct, let's take a look at another prominent mount used throughout history, the elephant. Thanks to their intelligence and aptitude to be reliably controlled, these massive animals were not uncommon on the battlefields of eras past. Species of both Africa and India were employed, equipped with howdahs of various design, essentially working as mobile fortresses. Their strength, ferocity, speed, toughness, ability to traverse difficult terrain, and capacity to carry multiple armed soldiers made them extremely effective in their role. As long as cannons were not invented, most weapons had a limited effect on them, and their opponents had to employ specific tactics to deal with them. Tactics made more difficult by the sheer terror these hulking behemoths instilled in infantry. Just to add the cherry on top, elephants were excellent tools of the battlefield as well, pulling heavy objects or transporting troops and cargo. This is a plethora of advantages, each more impressive than the last, but there are many notable factors as to why elephants weren't the be-all end-all of warfare. First off, their breeding, rearing, training and upkeep are rather demanding. Fielding larger amounts of them required quite a bit of capital, and the drawbacks don't stop there. Animals are not unfeeling machines. While their stature and the supporting driver give them confidence, there are numerous ways elephants can be spooked. Killing the driver is one such way, but striking at their more vulnerable parts, like the trunk, are also effective ways. Whether it is psychological or physical damage, elephants have a tendency to respond in a rather destructive way. While a horse may accidentally run over a man or two while they flee, a scared elephant may descend into a frenzy or panic and cause large casualties on either or both sides as they rage or make their exit. Additionally, they are rather big targets. Once heavy gunpowder weapons took to the battlefield, including ones specifically designed to counter elephants, they were relatively quickly phased out of warfare, being relegated to the role of a beast of burden. Massive monsters are rather common elements of most fantastical media, and as you can see, there are quite a few good reasons to employ them. However, having taken a brief look at the history of war elephants, it is evident they have a timer, a large threat with exploitable weaknesses which emphasize that methods designed to counter them would be developed. Conversely, in modern media, we often see that soldiers, in the fashion of fitting a square peg into a round hole, use their regular weapons to fight them. This would most definitely not be the case in general, as such suboptimal tactics would more often than not result in a loss. There is a reason diverse troop types and weapons are employed on the battlefield, regardless of the era we are talking about. Counter tools are always important. Speaking of countermeasures, there are some animals that were specifically fielded to combat select problems. Indeed, excellence against just one, at least semi-prominent tactic, troop type or other aspect of warfare is advantage enough to warrant its inclusion. One of those was actually against elephants. War pigs. No, I'm not talking about hogs as mounts, as that use is unprecedented, even if not strictly impossible or impractical under the right circumstances. What I'm talking about are mundane boars or nondescript beasts of the porcine variety that were sent squealing into enemy ranks, occasionally lit on fire. Horrific abuse aside, the squealing was apparently the reason they were used. Elephants were reportedly terrified of even non-inferno pigs, panicking and turning on their allies. This example is meant to emphasize the viability of a niche beast weapon, but linked to it is another possibility, one I would refrain from: sending savage, untamed animals into enemy ranks. What little historic evidence we have, and taking a look at the suggested beasts, tells us that this is a bad idea. Uncaging a very angry lion or other predator would have as much of a chance of resulting in friendly casualties as it has being killed before even reaching the opponent. Rhinos are a prominent Hollywood trope as a war beast, but they were very likely not employed beyond a few potential experimental cases. While appearing tough, a rhinoceros is relatively vulnerable to most battlefield weapons. Additionally, they are unlikely to just charge endlessly until they reach the enemy. Their eyesight is poor, and being rather aggressive in general, they are more likely to wreak havoc among the side that let them loose in the first place. So, while wild animals may have specific cases where they may provide an advantage, deploying a very angry monster with no way of controlling it and hoping they go the right direction is not a good plan. That being said, there is a potential advantage to sending less dangerous animals towards the enemy, even if there is no way to control them. In some cases, similar to war pigs, just knowing that the creature is going to flee towards the opponent is advantage enough. Like most things in war, it is a rather cruel tactic, but explosives or just plain old fire strapped onto various critters was precedented numerous times. Whether to set fire to tents or blow holes into ranks, birds, monkeys, dogs and bats have reportedly been fielded in such a way. Now, I am relatively certain few of you came here wanting to design unwitting suicide bombers for your setting, but alas, a potential tactic that is unlikely to be ignored, especially in more technologically advanced worlds. That being said, that is not something that necessarily needs dedicated training or a specific species. I should also mention that precisely knowing where an animal will go once let loose is an even greater advantage. Homing pigeons have been reliable message carriers for a very long time, with military applications as late as the Second World War. While the birds are not guaranteed to reach their destination, as accidents can always happen, they do so far more often than not, invaluable for sharing intelligence before the advent of radios, and potentially useful if encryption is insufficient or impossible, as they are more difficult to intercept from behind enemy lines. In times of need, dogs have also been known to carry messages, as their destination could also be predicted or even influenced, a distinct role for a distinct skill. Conversely, versatility in and of itself may also be the advantage that warrants a creature a place in the military. A jack of all trades, master of none. Something that is good or adequate at a lot of tasks, even if not the best choice for each, is still a great asset. If an animal is capable of covering multiple roles humans or human analogues cannot, there are many scenarios where it would overtake other, more specialized alternatives. We'll discuss the idea of alternatives a bit later, but it is important to note that if there is an option to train one species for various tasks, instead of training several beasts specific to each role, the first choice is often way more efficient. Even if the creature in question is not the best at either job, it requires fewer resources to recruit and fill them than having to accommodate other beasts with potentially widely different needs. This is especially true if the tasks in question are not simultaneous, as oftentimes the animals would be just sitting around doing nothing since one of the other species is required at the time. One prominent example for this, an animal I have only mentioned briefly so far, is perhaps the most important war beast we've had throughout history. Dogs are still a valuable asset and have been for millennia. Having been at humanity's side for at least 20,000 years, canines used in tribal wars is practically a guarantee. Before the advent of any substantial form of armor, their jaws and claws were dangerous weapons, so even though we have no material evidence of warhounds from that far back, it is safe to assume they were a thing. The earliest recordings come from antiquity, as they still served an important role as active battlefield animals. They were used as shock troops, breaking enemy formations or potentially routing weaker forces. Dogs were used in the conquest of the Americas, as native tribes generally had little to no protective gear, allowing hounds to tear at their flesh directly. This is just one aspect though, we are discussing versatility after all. Dogs are excellent sentries, can be effectively used as scouts, have delivered messages, drew weapons on carts, or served as mercy dogs during World War I, seeking out the wounded and providing first aid supplies. They are very good at tracking, including the detection of explosives, and above all else, they offer emotional support as well, capable of keeping the morale high. Over the years, the set of skills required from a war dog changed, as did their prominence fluctuate, but being the only animal that is this widely used across most, if not all modern military, speaks for itself. That being said, canine soldiers are a bit of a false equivalent for what I laid out. I said that versatility in and of itself is advantage enough, and while I stand by that statement, dogs are actually the best choice for some of the tasks they perform. Although this does highlight one last boon any monster may have that could cement its place as a battle animal: loyalty. Now, on its own, loyalty is not enough. A snail can be loyal to the death, they are not going to have you too much beyond serving as a mascot, and would not see wide-scale militarization as a result. The creature does require at least one strong advantage, or versatility, but if they tend to pledge their allegiance for life, they might be chosen over other options that are just sort of there, or even prone to change sides. These are broadly the advantages we can derive from the examples of our world, but naturally, any setting may present its own unique opportunities. However, most of those would likely be variations of the ones I've just listed. For example, let's say the beast in question is immune to a prominent type of weaponry or magic, making it an ideal distraction or serve as shock troops. This would be the toughness of an elephant altered to fit different circumstances. Naturally, there are exceptions, as always. Fire breathing, acid sprinkling, and spike launching war beasts never existed on Earth, but may present an option on a different planet. Either way, the key here is, as always, just because something would be cool is not reason enough for it to be put onto the battlefield. It needs to have a specific role, to be the best choice for one or more duties when everything is considered. Additionally, it needs to not have debilitating disadvantages, which brings us to the next section. Depending on the technological level of the setting they are employed in, be it prehistoric, medieval or futuristic, every beast will need to conform to different criteria, with younger worlds being more forgiving, while older ones would make most animals obsolete. What constitutes a debilitating weakness, one that would exempt the monster from ever being seriously considered as a war beast, also changes according to the role they fulfill. This is a daunting list, so I tried my best to generalize as much as possible without losing out on vital information and keep it relatively concise. Perhaps the primary drawback any creature could have, one that would under most cases rule out the possibility of a military career, is lacking obedience or being difficult to control. Now, most settings usually gloss over this and send massive monsters into the fray willy-nilly. Realistically, it would require high intelligence and rigorous training to make, say, a Hydra recognize the enemy and press forward into hostile lines on its own. As we've discussed, there are scenarios where sending in war beasts ahead of your soldiers is a viable tactic. However, I've also mentioned how that can be a double-edged sword. If you send in the Hydra and then follow up with your infantry, chances are that both sides are gonna get munched on. Alternatively, sending in the Hydra and waiting for the enemy to kill it before following up is not exactly a great tactic either. It may kill a couple of the enemy ranks, but the shock it causes and the broken lines it leaves behind will not get capitalized on. This problem is only exacerbated when multiple Hydras are used, as they'd likely not get killed at the same time, causing your troops to just stand there awkwardly while they wait for that one Hydra on the far right flank to finally bite the dust. This is all without mentioning that the Hydra may as well lose sense of direction or just set eyes on that one soldier it really hates and decide to waltz on over to feast on its supposed allies. Control or predictability are extremely crucial aspects of any war beast. Therefore, if the monster does not have the capacity to grasp the concept that not everything is its enemy, or be capable of differentiating the two sides, drivers or accompanying support troops capable of leading them are essential. When technology advances, all of this can become an even more pronounced issue. Why spend resources to rigorously train an avian creature to deliver bombs to key targets when you can just have a drone do it much more reliably? Remote-controlled machines or robots with artificial intelligence are far more reliable than an animal, as they were designed to follow instructions as opposed to being taught. Of course, mind control can forego the need for any of this, but as a rule of thumb, including the possibility to dominate the mind of any creature can lead to far-reaching world-building problems, so be careful with that. Additionally, it is important to consider how else that mind control may be utilized, and whether using it on a beast is the best use of said technology. Naturally, some roles we've already discussed do not require the level of discipline a strictly combat-focused one would. Delivering messages, towing cargo, or similar tasks can be usually done by animals that have a small degree of obedience or predictability. Each potential species one aims to fit into the warfare of their setting needs to be evaluated separately, but as always, real-life examples usually give a solid basis that helps us decide whether something can work or not. Moving on, perhaps the second most significant issue a war beast may have is being easily killed or incapacitated. While animals have self-preservation instincts in place, that is not necessarily what I mean by this. Depending on the weapons used, a monster may be too vulnerable to have any use, similarly to how elephants lost their prominence. If there is an easy counter to your expensive war beast that completely nullifies its effectiveness, using them is a liability. If gunpowder exists, it usually cancels out most things above a certain size, but there are numerous other possibilities too. There is a keen balance to keep here, as the world builder has to consider if there are any highly effective weapons or tactics, how accessible or easy those are, and whether their use would make the beast completely ineffective. Ignoring obvious ways to ward off the creature is ill-advised, as it leaves a gaping hole in the logic of the world. Such methods and tools should always be taken into account and modifications made accordingly, even if it makes the use of the war beast impossible. That being said, it is not always the case, even with counters. For example, polearms are an excellent anti-cavalry weapon, making frontal charges very costly. The billhook has a curved spike, specifically to pull riders from the saddle. These are just two ways to reduce the effectiveness of mounted soldiers, yet these armaments did not cause horses to be phased out. The reason for it is that they could be worked around. Rear charging an enemy already engaged in melee, or maneuvering past them and attacking troops ill-equipped to deal with cavalry are still possible tactics. In order for the counter to make the monster completely obsolete, it would have to be either very widespread, allowing most soldiers to dispose of the threat, or require only a handful of dedicated units that can reliably kill it before it causes much damage. These ideas more or less apply to most beasts that are not combat focused too. Message carriers are only viable if they aren't easily diverted, caught, or killed. Something that flies high, runs swiftly, or moves stealthily in addition to focusing on a destination and ignoring distractions is required. However, this criterion simply does not apply to many potential creatures linked to war, as by the time they would be in danger, it is too late anyway. Something that aids in construction, for instance, can be allergic to swords and explode the fleshy goo from lead bullets. It could still be quite useful behind the safety of allied forces. Well, maybe the exploding bit is a bit too liable to be exploited, but you get my point. One more thing to consider here is the potential of armor or protective gear. I think this would be given most of the time, even though we usually see war beasts tear up the enemy completely naked. That is not the optimal way to get the most out of them. Animals can be relatively easily conditioned to wearing equipment most of the time, and there is a very good reason why horse, elephant, or even camel armor existed back in the day. Just a little bit of extra resources spent, which can potentially mean the difference between life and death. In fact, I'd argue that even beasts with natural protection, like an ankylosaurus, would tremendously benefit from a bit of metal plating or a sheet of gambeson. Even if in a specific setting the monster in question has steel hide, adding another layer wouldn't hurt. Armor does weigh a significant amount, true, but since it is distributed over the whole body, it would have a minimal restriction on speed or movement if done right. Now, with modern guns and weapons, this would generally not be enough, unless the protection is high-tech or magical, but that is linked to a different issue we'll touch on later. Conversely, however, we can transition to a potentially decisive inability that would make the monster in question not even be considered for battlefield use: the potential to damage armored opponents. I've already mentioned how warhounds were exclusively used against enemies with little to no protection. While their jaws are strong, they are not nearly powerful enough to even dent plates, break mail, or do more than just lightly cut gambeson. While using them as a surprise may have some limited effectiveness the first time, sooner or later the other side catches on they won't even be affected by the assault of important assailants. Cut down or kicked aside, all the training and resources, not even mentioning the lives, are sacrificed for nothing. If a monster's role is specifically to cause damage, but is not strong enough to hurt an at least moderately protected target, there is no sense in investing any time or money to fill them. This is why packs of smaller animals do not generally work after a certain time period. They need to have a special weapon or be small enough to bypass the gear. A swarm of vicious carnivorous insects could be an excellent weapon, for example, even in the era of knightly armor or beyond the advent of firearms, as they are difficult to kill without something like a flamethrower or militarized bug spray. Controlling them might be hard though. Larger beasts do not necessarily suffer from this issue in most cases, as blunt force can hurt someone even under the metal sheets. So a Glyptodon could very well fatally injure heavy infantry. Even a large bear could have some limited success throwing soldiers around, causing concussions and disrupting formations. Size matters, however, so does the range of the attack. See, most beasts are confined to melee combat. As such, their effectiveness is greatly diminished in scenarios where warfare has advanced to primarily ranged armies. Unless impervious to the incoming projectiles, using any creature that has to get close is tricky and is likely impossible outside of confined spaces like city streets or spaceship corridors. A similar fate would befall monsters that can shoot for only a short distance. They would be useless in large open areas. Indeed, once long-range firearms overtake the battlefield, one would be really hard-pressed to find a potential use for creatures that cannot compete, potentially making their training and use far too much of a hassle to be worth it. In those few cases, they might not be useless. These last few ideas were rather interconnected and focused solely on fighting animals, so let's take a look at another possible issue that affects all: bravery. Beasts work differently from humans in this sense, and while both can potentially rout, most monsters would likely have a far stronger sense of self-preservation. Unless brainwashed or incredibly aggressive by nature, animals tend to flee if things don't go their way. They are not aware of the high-level information of why they are fighting or what the consequences of losing could be. Evolution has taught them that survival is paramount in most cases. There are ways to work around this obstacle, but when considering the effectiveness of animals used in high-stress environments, under the sound of visceral combat, gunshots, explosions, their tendency to rout or refuse to complete tasks need to be taken into account. There is a good reason war and police dogs are conditioned to the sound of guns. An animal has to remain cool-headed and act according to commands or its training, as such circumstances are inevitable. Of course, there are a few cases where this would not apply or may even come in handy, as a messenger pigeon would try to fly even faster if it feels in danger. However, these are relatively rare, linked to only a handful of tasks. In any other instance, bravery is an important characteristic. We've discussed both potential incentives and deterrents when it comes to using beasts in warfare, but there is one rather significant aspect I have only briefly mentioned so far. One that is rather complicated, has far-reaching consequences, and can be the reason a monster is or is not even considered for military service: logistics. Perhaps the most basic element of this is upkeep. There is a need to pay trainers and drivers, but that is the lesser factor. What have far more importance are the creature's needs, specifically food. Depending on its size, animals may widely differ in how much they eat, naturally. And that is an important thing to consider. Bigger beasts would have their patrons reach deep into their pockets, which could make them little more than a show of power, a niche tool, or simply too much of an inconvenience to be worth it. I'm primarily looking at skyscraper-sized dragons, for instance. There are more things wrong with them, but this is one more straw to pile on the camel with an already broken back. It is also important to note that herbivores are significantly cheaper to feed. Plants are primary producers, meaning they directly transform solar energy into a neat little snack, requiring no more steps in between. There are also numerous low-cost ways to make such fodder last a really long time. On the other hand, carnivores are quite a bit more expensive, as they need an intermediary animal to produce edible meals. Once again, I'd like to point out that energy transfer from one trophic level to the next is not very efficient, clocking in at around 10%. This means that, for the same amount of food, a carnivorous beast would require 10 times the forage, not to mention all other necessities that come with livestock, potentially drawing nutritious and expensive food away from human soldiers. On this planet, dogs and cats are two of the very few carnivores that were ever domesticated, both of which are relatively small. That dragon is looking more impractical by the minute. Similarly, beasts that require specific sources of nutrition are often more trouble than they are worth. For instance, even if koalas had a military application, the fact that they need one specific plant that offers very little utility elsewhere would make them rather impractical. A generalist animal is more desirable. However, to be completely thorough, if the carnivorous animal has some flexibility, that can help out a lot. If it happens to accept food beyond strictly meat, potentially capable of living off of scraps and leftovers, that is certainly a boon, helping set off the heightened cost of upkeep, especially if there is enough to go around to sustain all of them, circumventing the need for dedicated feed. This possibility is very size dependent though. Speaking of size, we should also think about the logistics of housing these animals. Do they require constant captivity like pigeons? Do they have specific needs when it comes to resting? Most beasts would be fine sleeping on the ground when marching, but there are outliers, especially among the less controllable specimens. When they are stationed within a camp, fort or city though, there has to be some sort of building to keep them off the streets, and where they are needed. It is important to think about what the habits of the monster would be in the wild, and whether that warrants any special treatment or facilities. This aspect also has to be aligned with how much the beast offers. For instance, few would finance the construction of a massive bridge for the troll to live under if all it does is draw very straight lines. I'm being facetious with this example, as the cost of defense would be a deciding factor only in rare cases, but there is one more option to consider. Must the special needs of the creature be satiated, or are they fine without them? If the trade-off weighs in favor of simple cages, then only a select few would spend more than necessary. The time they need to mature into a useful size and build is also an important characteristic. Beside the obvious world-building reasons you'd want these figured out, it does have an effect on military application too. Naturally, the faster it is the better, and the slower it is the less likely they'd be fielded. While rearing can usually be mostly done by the parents themselves, training has to start from a young age, as well as conditioning the war beast to humans and the idea of combat or the specific task. Linked to this, how long they need to be trained is also important. Add to this fertility and expected time to serve, and you get a rather complex set of parameters, potentially eliminating some monsters and favoring less obvious choices. In this sense, an R strategist species would be more ideal than a K strategist. The former animals tend to have a large number of offspring with quick growth but high mortality. A human factor could reduce said mortality, and the fact that care is not as important would come in real handy, essentially mass-producing combat beasts. On the other hand, case strategists have few children but make sure as many of them survive to adulthood as possible. This is not as beneficial for the purposes of feeding the machine of war, as the younglings would not be subject to most of the hardships of survival under human supervision anyway. However, case strategists also tend to live longer, offering a potentially extensive service time. That being said, most species tend to be on a spectrum and not all of them stick to either of the extremes. Still, definitely something to determine ahead of time, as it could have a balancing effect just like other items linked to logistics. One last aspect I'd link to this section is sociability or temperament. This can have numerous effects, most of which are more significant than one might think. Animals' tendency to cooperate may vary widely, as we've already discussed. Smart or less intelligent, pack animal or loner, territorial or wandering, none of these characteristics have a definitive answer for how a monster may act when being tamed or in the heat of battle. Personalities further complicate our ability to decisively predict the tendencies of individuals. A rather difficult question, but one where the world builder has relative freedom. However, it is important to note that there is a hierarchy of what one would expect from a war beast. As we've discussed before, a high level of aggression would be a serious issue, making numerous creatures simply unfit to be fielded by virtue of their temperament. While we've more or less covered part of this subject when talking about control, there is one rather significant boon sociability may have on top. Animals that are receptive to human interaction can notably increase troop morale, help people forget their woes. Every minute spent together reducing stress on both parties. Armed conflicts take a huge psychological toll, and anything that helps offset such damage is an asset on its own. Even in the case of animals unfit for war, employing them as mascots can result in numerous benefits we should not ignore. It is one of the wonders of the world how strong relationships of mutual affection can form between different life forms, beings that do not even perceive reality in the same way. The potential importance of the positive psychological effect this may have on both sides cannot be overstated. I often find myself simply enthralled by how special such a conceptually simple interaction can be. It makes me cherish the reality that such diverse and complex organisms had a chance to develop, and dread at the thought that this is all temporary, that there can be a time when there will be no one to experience it, no one to know this wonder, or remember there ever was a thing called life. It is as a good point as any to transition from the potential question of logistics to one more crucial component to all of this: alternatives. As time moves forward and technology advances, there comes a point where the use of animals for most roles becomes obsolete. Why would you strap a gun to an elephant when you can use a tank instead? Why send a courier pigeon when you can send that message instantly through a secure network? Why tow construction materials with oxen when there's a comfy truck waiting for you? Why spend time training a bear to fight when you can have 2 soldiers with assault rifles for the same or lower price. Depending on the role of the animal, alternatives may widely differ, not just in terms of the technological level they appear at, but also concerning their cost, reliability, and potential drawbacks. I may come off as a bit non-committal in a few areas, but this is definitely one where I do not have any sort of overarching statement. Every case is unique with a myriad of factors influencing the outcome. However, I can describe a few hypotheticals that may help, discuss a few commonly seen examples and why they might or might not work. For instance, mounting guns on almost any beast is not going to be a better alternative than a military vehicle. Machines can get shot up a fair bit before they stop working, and in most cases repairs are possible, even on the field. Mass manufacturing is more efficient than breeding, and beasts would also have to be trained. Hands on the steering wheel and feet on the pedal give far more control than what is possible by sitting on top, grabbing a bridle and yelling. In some fringe cases, a monster may be better at traversing difficult terrain, but the usefulness of tank treads or off-road vehicles should not be underestimated. A living being will rarely be able to compete with motorized machines, and even if they come close or exceed it in one area, the plethora of shortcomings would make them a liability. One would have to boost the chosen creature quite a bit to make it a viable alternative, and there are dangers associated with that too. Animals as special operatives or assassins are generally not a good idea either, but are far more likely to work. The thing is, one should not imagine the Spec Ops beast as an agile ninja. Even if the setting demands cloak and dagger shenanigans, a human or similar alternative is going to be more efficient for a number of reasons, the primary one being intelligence. Animals can move relatively unseen, but would have trouble identifying their target, especially if no clear clues can be given of it. Locked doors may present a problem, and few beasts would have the capacity to conceal themselves among people. A smaller size would make their natural weapons ineffective, while being bigger would lessen their sneaking potential. When it comes to more advanced settings, few could compete with guns, especially a sniper rifle. Still, some monsters absolutely have a chance at becoming a prominent assassination tool, but there's the catch: a tool, not an agent. Concealing venomous animals in key locales or sending in ravenous swarm of tiny creatures through small cracks are two distinct possibilities where specific species are needed and can offer options other methods cannot. They have the potential to be untraceable, perhaps even seem like an accident. If the animals in question have characteristics that improve their chances, they can be a safer option than poisoning or menial murder. That being said, antivenom and an air of randomness do not make them foolproof solutions, so they would not be the be-all end-all of assassin tools, in most cases at the very least. Another place where animals would rarely see use due to their alternatives is air combat. While flying animals can play multiple roles in war, few of them are fighting, at least after a certain point. Raptors are perfect examples to show that training flying creatures to attack targets is a possibility. In numerous settings, larger flying beasts carrying nasty cargo or swooping at the enemy may see use. They have a lot of potential counters, from polearms and shields to precise ranged weapons and roofs. Counters that may not work for other options. What I want to highlight is that once any form of aviation becomes possible without them, they become fully obsolete. Animals have far more constraints when it comes to flight, as they cannot use propellers and turbines to generate lift. Even if the monster is the size of a plane, it won't be able to carry the same weight, exacerbated further by the need for compartments, howdahs and all sort of equipment necessary to make the cargo actually stay on. Both of them would likely need pilots, but the extra mess would be more detrimental to one. All the problems that come with using living beings instead of unfeeling machines also resurface, including a few new ones. Oxygen gets scarcer the higher we go, and temperature goes down. A reptile or anything with membranous wings would have their means of flight suffer from frostbite or outright freeze, a problem that cannot be easily solved. Oxygen can be supplied, but that's yet more weight. Plus there's still the problem of speed. The more advanced aircrafts get, the larger the gap becomes. I'd struggle to imagine any living being flying faster than a jet plane without completely breaking physics. And I mean flying, not falling. Now, to mitigate the massive advantages modern technology provides over the fruits of evolution, there are the options of mechanical augmentations and genetic engineering. I'd argue that cyberpunk efforts are better used improving already superior options, as having fewer fleshy bits tend to lead to better results in most scenarios. This is coming from someone who loves animals and is completely indifferent to robots, so as much as it hurts, I must admit that the longer timeline goes on, the worse beasts will perform in comparison. Additionally, since genetic engineering still works within the confines of biology, only alleviating the constraints of evolution, it has a similar issue. While their effects can be monstrous, pathogens do not qualify for this topic, and there's only so much you can do with animals you cannot do better, almost effortlessly with machines. Given that machines are an option in the setting, of course. Alternatives are a very important thing to keep in mind, and world building benefits from working with and around them. Similarly, it is a good rule of thumb to change plans when too many problems come up. Alternatives may present a scenario where a particular thing we'd want to include is made redundant or wildly inefficient, requiring sweeping changes across the setting to remedy the issue. However, there are times when ideas should be let go of. Ham-fisting a war beast into a setting and changing everything to accommodate it may have catastrophic results. The more established a given world is, the worse the damage can be. Which brings me to my last point, one that is not specific to this topic, but rather important nonetheless. It may be tempting to just go ham and increase the effectiveness of a given creature to make it a great asset in war. However, that might have unforeseen consequences on warfare as a whole. Going overboard, an asset that is far more effective than anything else, being nigh invulnerable or blowing other weapons out of the water, sporting abilities that single-handedly can turn the tide of battle, is going to dominate in more ways than one. If everything else becomes obsolete, wars would become either absolutely one-sided or entirely consist of each participant just waiting for a super weapon to beat the other one. This is not a flaw or problem in and of itself, if that's what the writer's going for. But in such a scenario, everything should be changed accordingly. War would be no longer reminiscent of what we know it as. Unless there are specific limitations or mutually assured destruction is set up, regular military would be relegated to secondary or tertiary roles. Every political power would have to focus on finding counters to the beasts, for the first one to do so would sweep over their opponents. While there are numerous narratives that might work in such a setting, having essentially gods duking it out can greatly diminish investment. In a setting where everything is over the top, where stakes are no longer on a level we can fully grasp, caring for characters, plot and world become more difficult. Having just a few extremely powerful beings is still manageable, but introducing more and more overpowered things can quickly change that. Although fully exploring this idea is a subject for another time, as it deserves far more attention than I can give within a subsection of a different video. To very briefly sum up what we've gone over just now, war beasts have a lot of potential for interesting world building, but there are numerous things to work out about every single one. All manner of factors may affect their viability, role, and the period in which they could be found on the battlefield. What one has to take into account when developing such a creature include the reason why it is used, dedicated tactics and counter-tactics, the potential disadvantages and their severity, the associated logistics, what effect the technological level of the setting would have on it, whether there are alternatives that make it obsolete, and how they influence power levels. I hope I adequately explored the idea, even though I'm certain I did not cover everything in spite of my efforts. As with all things when it comes to writing and world building, anything can potentially work, but not everything will. Damn, look at the time. I guess I'm getting into the habit of extensive videos. And I even cut a bit of this one. I don't really plan how long any given one is going to be, I just write as long as I have things to say. I hope it was informative or entertaining enough. On an unrelated note, I was making this video during the invasion of Ukraine, and it felt really weird to write about war when one just broke out, not even that far from where I live. I don't really wish to discuss it in any detail, we all know war is bad, you don't need me to waste even more of your time with a pretentious speech. Let's just hope the loss of lives is coming to an end soon. I have no idea how to finish this video.